You are listening to the Digital Parent Podcast with your host, Ced Lewis.
Hey parents, welcome to another episode of the Digital Parent Podcast. Do you have that kid in your household that's spending way too much time on the internet? I mean, like hours at a time, either just, surfing on the internet or playing online video games, whatever. If so, this is the episode for you, because on this episode, we have Dr. David Greenfield, who is the leading expert when it comes to internet addiction. I mean, he's been on every show, CNN, Fox News, ESPN, Today Show, Morning Show, whatever show that's out there, he's been on it talking about internet addiction. And we were blessed to have him on this show to talk about that same topic as well. So please sit back and enjoy this episode. But before we get into it, a quick word from our sponsor, mSpy. Parents, mSpy is the ultimate monitoring tool for all devices. mSpy remotely tracks GPS locations, calls, texts, messages, WhatsApp, Snapchat, web browsers, pictures, and much more. With mSpy, you can also restrict unwanted calls, block websites, or even block apps. Go to mspy.com for more information. Hey, Dr. Greenfield, welcome to the Digital Parent Podcast. We're so glad to have you on our show today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Kind of give our listeners a background of how you got involved in this industry of internet addiction.
Well, like many things in life, there's some serendipity to it. I did my training in clinical psychology and psychiatry, and I had a specialty in addiction medicine and addictionology. And then I also had a very strong interest in technology and, from the time I was a kid. So after I finished my internship and residency, I started to practice. And then in the late 1990s, probably a little past 10 years of being in practice, I saw a small study published comparing gambling addicts to heavy internet users, or at that time they might have been referred to as internet addicts. This is when the internet was very new, and we were still doing slow-speed dial-up. At the same time, I had gotten my first, really decent computer and internet connection, and again, it was still dial-up. And I noticed when I went online that I was experiencing some degree of time distortion and dissociation. In other words, I was experiencing what I would now label a drug-like effect, or an alteration of mood and consciousness that was very different from normal consciousness. So that kind of got me curious, and at the same time I was talking to a colleague about it out in California, and he had done some preliminary research. There hadn't been a lot of research at this time. There was one book about to come out on the subject. There was virtually no medical research done at this time. And in 1998, in collaboration with ABC News, I put together the first large-scale study looking at internet use and internet abuse. And we had about 18,000 responses. And it gave us a snapshot, though it was not a perfect study, it gave us a snapshot of the fact that this is, in fact, a psychoactive medium, that it is it activates the same addiction pathways that other addictive behaviors and substances do, just like alcohol or drugs or gambling. Obviously, there are differences and there's overlaps. But I never intended, when that study came out, for the news wire service to pick it up. And really, that's what shifted my career in this direction, because the media was so interested in the idea that this could, in fact, be an addictive behavior. Now, here we are, fast forwarding, 17 years. And I don't think there's a doctor practicing in the field of mental health or addiction medicine that would argue that there's some addictive properties to the use of the internet in various ways, although we don't understand it. So in a sense, I never expected it to be my career, but it has since become my career, and have done writing and publishing. And I teach a course to psychiatric residents at the medical school where I'm on the faculty. So it's just become where my focus is, and I've been actively treating it very actively for the last 15 years or so. So that's kind of a short thumbnail of how I got into it, but it was in no way planned, and it continues to change and morph, obviously, as internet speeds have increased, and there's reasons for that. Not only that, but the issues related to Wi-Fi didn't exist, and now we have the smartphone, which is really a game changer on a lot of levels.
Yeah, Dr. Greenfield, one of the things you talk about in a lot of your books and also some of your articles is about this dopamine connection with technology. And I'm wondering, have we seen that arc based upon, like, when we had dial-up where it would take you minutes before you got into the internet, and now with high-speed internet and 4G, you can get on within maybe a second? Has that triggered and led to this dopamine connection that people are seeing with technology?
Well, I can sort of give you a qualified answer to that. I think I was one of the first people to posit that we were dealing with the same mesolimbic dopamine pathway, particularly the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. But I think, to answer your question, what we know about addiction medicine and any addictive substance or behavior is that the shorter the latency between the ingestion or consumption of the addictive substance or behavior and its intoxicating effect, its impact on your neurobiology, because that's what addiction is. It's all neurobiologic, although there are psychological variables. The shorter the latency, the more addictive it is. So speaking to your statement, it would make sense that, and it appears to be the case clinically and anecdotally, that the faster the internet connection, or the shorter the lag between that pick or click and the actual content, whatever that content is, whether it be a social media update or a pornography image or a game, or it doesn't really matter what the content is as long as it's salient or pleasurable to you. So the shorter that is, the more addictive it is. So it stands to reason that it would be more dopaminergically responsive. And the neuroimaging studies that have been done really support the activation of the dopamine pathways. When I first started talking about it, we didn't have those studies, but now we have enough fMRI and PET scan studies that show that we're activating those centers of the brain when we're doing the internet. There's also some other studies looking at prefrontal cortical blood flow, which you can actually more easily measure without putting the person in a complicated machine. And in fact, we're looking at the same activation issues around dopamine. So I don't think there's any question. Dopamine is a pleasure neurochemical. It's really what gets us going with regard to it gets us going in terms of experiencing that pleasure. And if it didn't activate or didn't elevate, we probably wouldn't be doing it, or we wouldn't be doing it in a way that is overused.
Right. So when you talk about the dopamine connection, I'm wondering with social media and with status updates. So, everyone has a smartphone. You get an instant alert if somebody hits you up on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever. Has the dopamine effect kind of fed into the growth of those apps that give you those constant updates?
I can't quote you a study on that because I don't know that there's been a study that specifically looked at social media and dopamine, but extrapolating from all the other research, as well as what I've seen in other areas of addiction, Yes, because what the update does is, and this is where the smartphone kind of comes in, is it activates. We have two sort of neural behavioral conditioning pathways or processes that are going on. We have the classical conditioning pathway, and we have the operant reward pathway. So the operant is that if you're more likely to repeat a behavior that's pleasurable, that's sort of basically Skinner's work. And he came up with the idea that there are different ratios or rather schedules of reinforcement that would be more likely to increase the likelihood of something being repeated. But when you get a notification that there's an update or a piece of information or even a text or an email that's waiting for you, there's an anticipated reward. And we know from basic dopamine research that the anticipation of a reward actually elevates dopamine even higher than the actual reward itself. So we get kind of a spike of anticipation, and then we get the actual activity where we look it up, and then we get a secondary spike of dopamine. But the anticipation is related to that notification. So that's why smartphones I call the world's smallest slot machine, and I call the internet the world's largest slot machine, because it operates on that same variable schedule of reinforcement that we see with a slot machine. And as you know, with a slot machine, people will sit there for hours as they get input coming in. And because the rewards are variable in frequency and intensity, they tend to be less, or rather more resistant to extinction. In other words, they just don't go away. People just keep doing it over and over and over. And that's really the addiction. An addiction is that neurologic or neurobiologic process. Now, and there are changes in the brain that occur as a result of that. And once you start that sort of pattern, the brain becomes used to having those elevations, and more receptors are developed for that dopamine, and then you end up with some degree of dopamine downregulation and desensitization. So there's all sorts of changes that happen with addiction, many of which are reversible, some of which don't appear to be. So, in other words, once you develop a pattern, it's very hard to change it. There's always a sort of sensitization that exists towards that pattern.
So when it comes to, I guess, addiction for like teens or kids, what are some of the signs for parents to tell that, your child really has or in that addiction type of problem?
Well, I think, I get emails from parents from all over the country pretty regularly. I think the most obvious is that they're spending an excessive amount of time on the device, whatever the device is. I can't tell you for sure what, there's no way to tell you, what that number would be. Or how much is too much, or I'm just trying to word it. The first thing is that they're spending a lot of time on it, and then of course there are other changes like that you would notice, like changes in social behavior, less frequent real-time social contact. Probably the most common is a reduction in academic performance when we look at teens and in middle school, high school, college-age kids. They're invariably, you'll see a dip in their academic performance because they're spending so much time online or doing these other activities that they're not really attending to their schoolwork. There are other, irritability, withdrawal, hiding it, making, having secretive type behaviors. There are, more sedentary behavior, less interest in activity, physical activity. There's about 10 different signs and symptoms. You don't necessarily have to have all of them. And they don't necessarily mean that they've got an internet addiction. First of all, they could have other addictions or other behavioral or substance-based issues. But with internet addiction, it's a little bit tricky because everybody uses the internet, and it's such an accepted part of our culture now, especially in what I call Generation D, these digital natives. They've grown up with it. So parents almost expect their kids to be on it a lot, and there's a little bit of a forgiveness of what they consider to be normal, but then there's a line that gets crossed where normal really becomes abnormal.
So have we get to the point where in the DSM-4 that, internet addiction is getting ready to be labeled, as a disorder? Well,
you're behind one DSM. We now have DSM-5.
Okay, thank you.
That's okay. And in fact, there is a provisional categorization for internet use disorder or video game use disorder that is in that diagnostic manual right now. It has not been fully accepted as a diagnosis. It's basically waiting for further research. Much of that research is being done as we speak and is continuing to be done. So I would not at all be surprised that in the next revision that we will see some categorization formally for internet addiction. It's pretty unusual to have a diagnosis show up as quickly as it has in the DSM-5. It took pathological gambling, I think, 40 years to show up. And it's a long, arduous process. But I don't have any doubt that you'll see it and that it will sort of further legitimize it. But again, most clinicians would not argue that it's, in fact, a real issue. What we label it, whether it's internet, the media kind of calls it internet addiction. People call it internet addiction. But, it'll probably be labeled more something like internet use disorder or pathological internet use. And then there'll be sort of subcategories of the content areas that tend to be most abused, whether that be social media or gaming or sexual or pornography or something like that.
Now, is there a difference between the addiction with social media versus playing video games?
Well, there's a difference. Functionally, in terms of the impact on your life, there may not be a difference in the sense that you'll end up with the same deleterious impact. In terms of frequency of seeking treatment, and again, I'm talking about a small percentage of the population. I would say we're talking 3 to 6% of the population in the U.S. as something that might be qualified as an internet addiction-like diagnosis. There's a lot of other people who are overusing it and abusing it, but just not to a point that it's interfering with their life severely. The ones that we see the most in practice and in treatment, and the two treatment centers that I'm most familiar with, which is ours and then a Restart out in at Washington. By and large, gaming is the number one sort of drug of choice on the internet or through the internet. The games themselves are designed to be addictive. They're designed to keep people compelled. Their schedules of reinforcement are very, very, very specific. They're very, very specific to keeping people engaged and then giving them enough reinforcement and reward to just keep them going long enough to activate them.
I want to ask you a question about that because there's been a lot of controversy about the gaming industry and the porn industry, in particular the porn industry trying to target young gamers, like young adolescent boys, by releasing porn apps on Xbox 360 or whatever your gaming system of choice because they've seen some type of correlation with the dopamine effect. So if you have these kids that are wired and they're getting all these rewards on the game system, it's only logical that they cross over into pornography. Right. at the same time, there's a lot of these games that are releasing porn apps with the game apps.
Yeah, well, first of all, you have to understand that the nucleus accumbens, which is that very, very powerful set of nuclei in the limbic system of the brain, is the primary site for dopaminergic arousal from sex. So we're dealing with the same area of the brain. So the porn industry knows that sex is extremely powerful and in and of itself is an addictive medium. There's no question pornography is habit forming and addictive. So I'm not surprised that they would use an addiction prone medium to then offer an addiction prone content. And then what you end up with is what I call a synergistic amplification of the process. In other words, you end up with like a synergy of the addictive medium further facilitating the addictive content.
And have you seen any of those cases within your clinic?
With cases of what? Where
of kids having a gaming addiction, but also tied into porn addiction. Yeah,
I mean, I would say a large percentage of the patients that I see are using both. Most of them are boys, although girls are using pornography too. So I would say that there's a large percentage of people that are using both. I can't give you a statistic, but I would say probably half. And it may be even higher because a lot of them don't admit to using pornography. It's still considered a bit secretive.
Right.
But it's a big issue. And the porn industry has always been an early adopter of technology ever since, really, from the time of the printing press moving forward. The porn industry has, and it really heated up when the VHS and beta tapes were invented. And then from there to the CD and DVD, and then, of course, the Internet was, they were some of the first commercial uses of the Internet that were financially profitable. And it continues to be. There are hundreds of thousands of adult websites. It's big, big business. Just to give you an idea of a statistic, if you add up all the revenue from online or Internet-based pornography, and then you add up all the revenue from all professional and collegiate sports, including ticket sales, television and radio, merchandising, concessions, the porn industry makes more.
Wow. That's huge. That's a huge number.
It's a big number. Yeah. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. The number changes all the time, but, I've heard numbers as high as 17, 18, 19 billion. You're talking about, and this isn't just among adolescents and teens. I mean, there are adults using this as well. And I treat adults who have issues with online pornography as well.
Now, one of the things I want to talk about when it comes to parents and controlling internet use, I've personally seen a couple cases where when teens are being restricted, or if a parent decides to take away a cell phone or a smartphone, that those teenagers become very aggressive to the point of being physically aggressive, to the point they may want to attack their parent. How dangerous is it? And have you seen cases where kids have actually got into physical altercation with parents for trying to take away their technology?
Yeah, I've seen it. Yes, I've seen it. I haven't seen if you look in the news, you'll see there's a long history of cases that were pretty egregious, where kids have actually physically harmed or attacked their parents, and there are, a couple of dozen cases where parents were killed. I don't by any means want to say that that's normal. I do think the more typical reaction is extreme frustration and anger, often threats, at times physical violence. I'd say physical violence is less common, then the behavioral oppositional threats. I mean, I frequently will hear threats: if you take it away, I'll kill myself, or I'll do something, or I won't do my schoolwork, or a lot of manipulative kind of withdrawal-like reactions for when it's removed. The problem is that a lot of parents don't know how to manage this, and just removing the technology without a treatment plan and without an IT person involved in really managing it in a sophisticated way, what happens is the parents usually give in at some point. And then what you've really trained the kid to do is, basically all they have to do is throw enough of a fit, and their parents will just give in.
And that's exactly what I've seen. It's like a cursive cycle. You got the parent that gets the courage to stand up and say, look, enough is enough. I'm going to take this away as a consequence. And the kid immediately becomes verbally aggressive or, physically starts to intimidate. And then the parent backs down and the issue goes away. It's kind of like, how do we coach parents to have that conversation, either to stay firm or do something different to get the same goal?
Yeah, a lot of it is, a lot of the time I do spend working with parents, either in consultation or in collaboration during the treatment, in terms of empowering them to manage it. But I think a lot of parents really can't manage it alone. So we work, I have an IT person that works for our clinic, and we use a lot of external monitors, blocks, filters, etc., to kind of take it out of the parent's hands, because it's very hard for a parent to do all this and to be on top of it. Not to mention, logistically, it's very hard because the parent can't be with that kid all the time. So at least in the home, if we work with blocking the router and managing some of the devices, we have some ability to impact either elimination or limitations on the use of the technology, and I'm a big advocate of that. I think doing it, obviously you want to empower the parents to take control, but you have to understand what happens in these families is a generational hierarchical reversal, because these kids have more knowledge about the devices and the technology than the parents do. So knowledge is power, and these kids end up with a lot of power because they know how to work around all of these little, these filters and blocks that you get from the internet service providers or the download from the internet are just not sophisticated enough to keep these kids off of it.
I think they're smart having an IT person on your team, because basically you can block everything from the access point coming into the house, which decreases those arguments. Like, you can pretty much control what they see, what they don't see. You also can control screen time at the access point. Yeah,
I think that is absolutely essential. There has to be something that sort of takes it out of the parent, and then that also eliminates some of that struggle that you're talking about, because it now you do, I don't want to say it's a simple solution and you just do this and then it solves all the problems, because there are other issues, both psychologically and neurobiologically, that have to be addressed, because when you remove this technology or limit it severely, you're leaving a huge gap in their dopamine activation. So there's going to be there could be a rebound of hypofrontality and desensitization and a reduction in dopamine, because so they may end up looking more depressed. And in fact, initially they're experiencing some degree of withdrawal. So you have to kind of treat all that. You also have to teach them how to redevelop what I call a real-time life. They literally have spent so much time on whatever their drug of choice online is that they've forgotten what a real-time life looks like and don't have any clear idea of how to live one.
Is one strategy for parents, kind of like, I guess you look at, addiction studies with heroin, where you take a heroin addict and put them on something, that's less powerful. Would you do the same thing with a person that's addicted to the internet? Would you not necessarily stop the addiction, but maybe put them something that's more conscious, something that's more green, that they can actually learn something from, opposed to being on a video game, fighting?
We actually are looking at naltrexone and naloxone. I mean, there are some preliminary studies that are actually looking at blocking some of those opiate receptor pathways as well. But short of there aren't a lot of medication treatments that we've seen great success with for this issue. But in response to your statement, do you want to substitute something that is, healthier or more green or more sustainable or more rewarding or more real-time based? The answer is absolutely yes. That's a big part of the treatment, is to rebuild that which has atrophied, and then to sort of develop pleasure pathways associated with those new behaviors. And that's basically a habit is a neurobiologic pathway. You rebuild those neural connections, and you let other neural connections atrophy and reduce.
Now, let me ask you a question about gambling, because I don't see a lot of internet addiction and gambling with young people. But I'm wondering, is it showing up in different ways? Like when you look at games like Candy Crush or Clash of Clans, like those small handheld games that kids are addicted to, are they using those same gambling concepts in order to target younger consumers on smartphones?
Well, all gaming as a gamble, is sort of built on a gambling platform. So yes. Don't forget, online gambling is not legal right now in the United States. They sort of blocked it. You can't easily get access to it. Where I see it is in some of those games. I also see it in sports betting and even in some of the fantasy, fantasy baseball or basketball or football sort of gambling. I think we'll see it more in that area. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't necessarily, I haven't seen any literal gambling issues recently because they're not accessible online.
Great. So what is, one last question, what would be the best tip that you would tell parents in order to kind of prevent internet addiction before it actually takes place?
I think to oversimplify, you really have to be monitoring your kids' digital footprint pretty early. I'm talking about, grammar school, watching their use and your messages about how much use is okay from really grammar school on, because these devices are in their hands in grammar school. And the other thing, there's been a lot done on watching what you're doing, because your kids are watching you. And in the cases where we've talked to kids and asked them about their parents' behavior, in many cases, the parents are overusing the devices, which is modeling that behavior for their kids. So the parents really need to get with the program too, and be very conscious of their use or overuse or abuse of the technology, because there's a tendency for them to say one thing but then do another. And then to be really aware of what their kids are doing. No different than they would be aware of what their kids are doing in terms of what friends they have or who they're hanging out with or the kind of people that they're involved with in their lives. You want to be really mindful of that. And then teaching them good, what I would call conscious computing, the idea that you mindfully use the devices as a tool, but not as a form of lifestyle or entertainment. So there's a lot of sort of education around managing the technology so it doesn't manage you. And a lot of that has to start very early on. And then I think it needs to be backed up with some blocks. I don't think if you have unfettered, unlimited access, I think it's going to, in many cases, get overused. I just do. It's just that compelling and that, if not addictive, it's certainly habit forming. And I think that's unavoidable. And I think it's also important to, not let the kids sleep with their phones in their rooms and, to keep them charging in a public place. We did a recent study. I did a study with AT&T, and 60, 70% of people sleep with their phone next to their bed or under their pillow. That doesn't really encourage healthy use.
Well, great. Thanks, Dr. Greenfield, being on this show. I think you gave a lot of great tips to parents and to young people as well. Where can people find your information if they want to see your articles and more books?
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of my background first. So my name is Dr. David Greenfield. The website, I'm the founder of the Center for Internet and Technology Addiction, and I'm an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. They can find information about this topic and certainly get in contact with me through our website, virtual-addiction.com, virtual-addiction.com. And that'll point them in the right direction in terms of further information and or if they wanted to have a consultation with me.
Great. Any books that you suggest they should pick up?
There are about 40 or 50 books on the subject right now. I'm a little bit hesitant to recommend any one book over another. But I think the best thing to do would be to just do a search online on the topic of internet addiction and see what compels them. I think the books are helpful, but I think sometimes getting somebody that has worked with this issue to help guide them in the process can be even more helpful. But, certainly my book, Virtual Addiction, is available. Some of the books by Dr. Young, I think, are great. And there are a number of other books that have been written on the subject that are out there. There are probably 50 to 75 books on the subject now, which, if you think about it, in 15 short years is quite a lot.
And do you provide any one-on-one consultation online with parents and teens that may be really suffering from internet addiction?
Yes, we do a lot of online and Skype consultation, telephone consultation with people all over the country and in Canada and other countries. We do that every week. We do consultations constantly, and sometimes the purpose of the consultation is just to provide them with information and get them some pointers to get them going in the right direction. Sometimes they will come in for treatment. If they're close enough, they can come in for in-person treatment. And then some people will fly in for one of our intensive outpatient programs, which we run, where the person is here for 1 to 2 weeks for an intensive outpatient treatment program. And that's available. All that really is determined based on a consultation with the parents. But sometimes just to help them, point them in the right direction.
Well, great. We'll make sure we put all those links in our show notes so parents can get that valuable information. Once again, thank you for being on our show.
My pleasure.
Hey, parents, I hope you really enjoyed the episode with Dr. David Greenfield. And make sure you go to our show notes at digitalparentpodcast.com and get more information, especially if your child is in really need some intense therapy. The links will be there for you to get in contact with Dr. Greenfield, where you can do some type of online therapy or even fly to one of his facilities. And please subscribe to the Digital Parent Podcast on iTunes. And you can always follow us on Facebook at Digital Parent and also on Twitter at Spy Parent. Thanks.